Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the sounds of a struggle echoed from down the tunnel. She couldn't see what was happening, but every shot fired, every thud of bodies colliding, sent waves of fear crashing over her. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, but more than that, she wanted to know that Luca was okay. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Sophia's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Luca who stood in the doorway. It was one of the Ferraros. Sophia's breath hitched as the figure stepped through the doorway, casting a long shadow across the small room. The man who stood before her was tall and imposing, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light. He wore a smirk of confidence, as if he had been expecting to find her here all along. One of the Ferraros. Panic surged through her veins, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed. The sound of gunfire and chaos still echoed in the tunnels outside, but here, in this moment, everything seemed to slow down. The man's dark eyes scanned the room before settling on her, a predatory gleam lighting them up. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth, mocking. "Look what we have here. Luca Moretti's little treasure." Sophia took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room was too small, too closed off. She was trapped. "You're coming with me," the man said, taking a step forward. His voice held no room for negotiation. "Luca's empire will crumble the moment he realizes we have you." Sophia's pulse quickened. She had known the Ferraros wanted to use her as leverage, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave of fear through her. They didn't care about her. They only cared about what she meant to Luca. And if she was taken, Luca would do anything to get her back. But she wasn't about to make it easy for them. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. The man's smirk widened as he took another step toward her. "You don't have a choice, sweetheart." Sophia's mind spun, desperate to think of something, anything, that would buy her time. Luca had told her to stay here, that he would protect her. But now, he wasn't here, and she was alone, facing the enemy he had tried so hard to keep her away from. Just as the man reached for her, a shot rang out, the deafening sound reverberating through the small room. Sophia flinched, her eyes widening as the Ferraro staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, and his smirk twisted into a snarl of pain. "Get away from her," Luca growled from the doorway, his gun still raised, his face a mask of fury. Sophia's heart leapt at the sight of him, a surge of relief washing over her. But it was quickly followed by a new wave of fear as the Ferraro turned toward Luca, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think this changes anything, Moretti?" The man spat, his voice thick with pain. "We'll take everything from you. This war won't end until you're dead." Luca's expression didn't falter. "You'll die before I let that happen." The Ferraro let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You're a fool. You're risking everything for her. Do you really think she's worth it?" Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the man's words hung in the air. She felt the weight of them, the danger they represented. The Ferraros didn't care about her. They only saw her as a pawn in their war against Luca. But what they didn't realize was that Luca wasn't playing the same game anymore. Luca's eyes flicked to Sophia for a brief moment before he pulled the trigger again. This time, the shot was lethal. The Ferraro crumpled to the ground, his body falling limp as blood pooled beneath him. The room fell into silence, the tension thick and suffocating. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, her body still frozen in shock as she stared at the man's lifeless form. Luca lowered his gun and turned to her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something raw in his eyes, something that told her he was holding back the full weight of what he was feeling. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low but laced with concern. Sophia shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She hadn't been hurt, but she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her, everything Luca had done to protect her, everything he had risked. Luca took a step toward her, his gaze softening as he reached out to touch her arm. "You're safe now," he said quietly, but the way his hand lingered on her skin, the way his eyes searched hers, made it clear that the danger wasn't entirely gone. There was still something between them, something dangerous and undeniable. Sophia swallowed hard, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She had come so close to being taken, to being used as a weapon against Luca. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, risking everything to keep her safe. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Luca's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes flicked away, as if he was struggling with something he didn't want to admit. When he finally looked back at her, there was a vulnerability in his gaze that sent her heart racing. "Because I can't lose you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The raw emotion in Luca's voice, the intensity of his gaze, shook her to her core. She had seen Luca as a monster, a man who took what he wanted without remorse, but now she saw something more, something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. Before she could respond, Luca stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, tender in a way that left her breathless. For a moment, the chaos outside faded, and all she could see, all she could feel, was him. "You're mine, Sophia," Luca whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I protect what's mine, no matter the cost." Sophia's heart raced, her mind spinning with everything that had led them to this moment. She should push him away and demand her freedom. But she couldn't. Not when her own heart betrayed her. Not when she felt the magnetic pull between them growing stronger with each passing second. "I don't want to be your prisoner," she whispered, her voice trembling. Luca's gaze softened, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide. "You're not my prisoner, Sophia." Her breath hitched at his words. "Then what am I?" Luca's eyes darkened with something deeper, something more dangerous. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "You're the only thing in this world that I can't control." Sophia's pulse quickened as Luca's words hung in the air. She had never expected this, had never expected him to admit that she was more than just a pawn in his world. But now, standing so close to him, feeling the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze, she couldn't deny what was happening between them. Before she could say anything, Luca's lips were on hers, soft but insistent, claiming her in a way that made her head spin. The kiss was slow, deep, filled with everything he hadn't said, everything he had been holding back. And Sophia, despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, found herself melting into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as she kissed him back with the same intensity. It wasn't just passion, it was something more. Something raw and real that neither of them could deny anymore. When Luca finally pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin, Sophia felt the weight of the moment settle over them. This wasn't just a kiss. This was a shift, a change in everything that had come before. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had been holding inside. Luca's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, his eyes locked onto hers with a mix of protectiveness and desire. "You don't have to be," he murmured. "Not while I'm here." The silence between them was heavy, charged with the emotions they had both been too afraid to admit. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder, closer. Luca's expression hardened, and he stepped away from her, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice cold once more. "I'll handle it." Sophia's heart raced as Luca moved toward the door, his body tense, ready for another fight. But as he reached for the handle, the door was kicked open, and a figure stepped inside, one that made Luca's face pale with shock. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and imposing, with the same dark intensity as Luca. But this wasn't just any intruder. It was Luca's brother. The room fell into a stunned silence as Luca's brother stepped through the doorway, his presence commanding and cold. He was taller than Luca, with the same sharp, chiseled features, dark eyes burning with intensity. His gaze swept over the room, landing first on Luca and then on Sophia. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face, sending a chill down her spine. "Luca," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's been a long time." Luca's entire body went rigid, his hand still resting on the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it. His eyes darkened with a mix of emotions, anger, shock, and something deeper, something far more personal. "Matteo," Luca growled, his voice filled with barely restrained fury. "What are you doing here?" Matteo's smile widened as he stepped further into the room, his eyes flicking back and forth between Luca and Sophia. There was something predatory about the way he moved, as if he were a hunter circling his prey. "You didn't think I'd let the Ferraros take everything, did you?" Matteo said, his voice smooth and confident. "I have my own plans." Sophia's heart raced as she watched the tension between the two brothers unfold. She could feel the history, the unspoken conflict simmering between them. This wasn't just about the Mafia war. This was personal. Luca took a step forward, his expression hard as stone. "This isn't your fight, Matteo. You should have stayed away." Matteo chuckled softly, his eyes narrowing. "Stay away? From the empire that should have been mine? From the power you took from me?" His voice was laced with bitterness, and Sophia could see the depth of the rift between them. Whatever had happened between the two brothers, it had left scars. "This isn't about power anymore," Lucas said, his voice deadly calm. "It's about survival. And if you've thrown your lot in with the Ferraros, you've chosen the wrong side." Matteo's eyes flicked towards Sophia again, and the intensity of his gaze sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "I'm not here because of the Ferraros. I'm here because of her." His voice dropped, and Sophia's stomach twisted with dread. "I heard rumors that you'd taken someone special." Luca's hand tightened on his gun, and for a moment, Sophia thought he might pull it, but instead, he took another step forward, his body tense with barely contained rage. "Stay away from her," Luca warned, his voice low and dangerous. Matteo smirked, clearly unfazed by his brother's threat. "Oh, little brother, you've always been so predictable. Always so willing to protect what's yours, no matter the cost." He took another step closer to Luca, his eyes glinting with something dark. "But tell me, Luca, how far are you willing to go for her?" Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Matteo's words hung in the air. The tension in the room was suffocating, the unspoken challenge between the brothers thickening with every second. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, but her throat was too tight with fear. Luca's eyes flashed with anger, and this time, his hand moved to draw the gun. "You don't want to find out." Matteo's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. "Always the hero, aren't you?" he sneered. "But you're forgetting something, Luca. You and I, we're the same. We both know what it takes to survive in this world. And sometimes that means sacrificing the things you care about." Sophia's heart raced as Matteo's words pierced through the tension, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in Luca's eyes. Hesitation, uncertainty. It was only for a brief second, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Luca had always seemed so certain, so in control. But now, with his brother standing before him, the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Matteo's gaze shifted to Sophia once more, and this time, he took a step toward her, his eyes gleaming with intent. "You don't belong in this world, do you?" he asked, his voice almost taunting. "You're just a pretty little pawn in my brother's game." Sophia stiffened, her pulse quickening. She didn't respond, but Matteo's words cut deep. She had spent so long trying to resist Luca's control, trying to hold on to her own sense of power. But now, standing between two dangerous men who were bound by blood and torn by betrayal, she felt more like a pawn than ever. Luca's hand shot out, grabbing Matteo by the collar and shoving him back. "I told you to stay away from her," he snarled, his voice filled with raw anger. Matteo laughed, his face inches from Luca's as he sneered. "What are you going to do, Luca? Kill me? Your own brothers?" For a moment, the room was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. The tension between them was unbearable, and Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, unable to look away. Luca's hand trembled slightly, the gun still gripped tightly in his other hand. His face was a mask of fury, but behind it, Sophia could see the conflict, the war raging inside him. This wasn't just about protecting her. This was about years of betrayal, years of resentment, all coming to a head. "You don't know me anymore, Matteo," Lucas said through gritted teeth. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect what's mine." Matteo's smile faded, and for the first time, his eyes darkened with something more serious, something more dangerous. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." Before Luca could react, Matteo twisted out of his grip, shoving him back with surprising force. Luca staggered slightly but quickly regained his footing, his eyes blazing with fury as he raised the gun, aiming it directly at his brother's chest. "Enough!" Luca shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "This ends now, Matteo. Walk away, or I will make sure you never come back." The tension between the brothers reached a boiling point, the room filled with the heavy weight of unspoken threats and years of resentment. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she watched, her heart pounding in her chest. But Matteo didn't move. His eyes flicked to the gun in Luca's hand, and then back to his brother's face. "You won't do it," he said quietly, his voice laced with certainty. "You won't pull that trigger." Luca's hand trembled slightly, and for a moment, Sophia thought Matteo might be right. She could see the struggle in Luca's eyes, the battle between his loyalty to family and his need to protect what was his. And then, without warning, Matteo lunged forward. Luca fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the small room. Sophia's heart stopped as Matteo staggered back, his hand clutching his chest where the bullet had struck. Blood seeped through his fingers, his face contorted in shock and pain. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Matteo stumbled, his eyes wide as he stared at Luca, disbelief written across his face. "You," Matteo gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You shot me?" Luca's face was pale, his hand still gripping the gun tightly, but his expression was cold, controlled. "I told you, Matteo. This ends now." Matteo's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, his hand still clutching his chest as blood pooled beneath him. He looked up at Luca, his eyes filled with a mix of hatred and something else, something like betrayal. "You're just like me," Matteo whispered, his voice weak. "You'll never escape it." And then, with a final gasp, Matteo's body went still. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Sophia stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at Matteo's lifeless form, the reality of the situation sinking in. Luca slowly lowered the gun, his face a mask of cold, ruthless determination. But as his eyes flicked to Sophia, she could see the cracks beneath the surface, the conflict, the pain, the weight of what he had just done. He had killed his own brother. Sophia's heart ached as she looked at Luca, her mind spinning with the events that had just unfolded. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between them was thick, filled with unspoken emotions, unspoken questions. Luca took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto hers. I had no choice, he said quietly, his voice laced with emotion. Sophia's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as she met his gaze. She knew that Luca had done what he had to do to protect her, to protect everything he had built. But the weight of it, the weight of his actions, of his choices, was suffocating. Before she could respond, Luca stepped closer, his eyes filled with a raw, dangerous intensity. I told you, Sophia, he murmured, his voice low. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. Sophia's breath hitched, her heart racing as Luca's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. The intensity in his gaze was undeniable, filled with both desire and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken with both fear and longing. And now, Luca whispered, his lips brushing against hers, you're truly mine. The room was thick with tension, the echoes of gunfire and chaos, now distant memories as Luca and Sophia stood facing each other in the small, dimly lit room. Matteo's body had been removed, and the mansion was eerily silent, save for the sound of their breathing, heavy and uneven. The weight of everything they had been through hung in the air between them. Death, danger, betrayal, and something far more complicated. Luca's dark eyes never left Sophia's, his gaze intense, searching, as if trying to find something in her expression that he couldn't name. She could feel his need, his desperation, simmering beneath the surface, barely held in check. There was no more war to fight, no more enemies to kill. Only this moment, only them. The man who had stood before her moments ago, the ruthless Mafia lord who had killed his own brother to protect her, now seemed vulnerable, exposed in a way she had never seen before. And it wasn't just Luca's vulnerability that she saw. It was her own heart, raw and open, laid bare before him. She had resisted for so long, trying to convince herself that Luca was nothing more than her captor, the man who had taken her against her will and plunged her into a world of darkness and danger. But now, after everything they had faced together, Sophia couldn't deny the truth any longer. She wanted him. She had always wanted him. I don't want to run anymore, Sophia whispered, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with certainty. I'm tired of fighting this. Luca's breath caught, and for a moment, he seemed frozen, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. His hand reached out, hesitating only for a second before brushing against her cheek, his touch gentle, tender in a way that sent a shiver through her body. You don't know what you're saying, Luca murmured, his voice rough, strained with the effort of holding back. You should leave. You should go before. Before what? Sophia interrupted, her voice soft but determined. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't care. Before I make a mistake? Or before you do? Luca's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked away, his hand falling from her cheek. But Sophia wasn't going to let him hide from this. She wasn't going to let him hide from her.
Not now.
I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice firm, her heart racing as she took another step closer until their bodies were only inches apart. Not anymore. Luca's eyes snapped back to hers, dark and filled with a storm of emotions, desire, anger, fear, and something deeper. Something that scared him as much as it thrilled her. "You should be," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Sophia's breath caught as she looked up at him, her pulse quickening with the weight of his words. But she didn't back down. "Not this time." "Show me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with raw emotion. "Show me everything." Luca's control snapped. In one swift motion, he pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing against hers with a force that took her breath away. The kiss was fierce, demanding, filled with all the tension that had been building between them since the moment they met. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and there was no turning back now. Sophia melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders as she kissed him back with equal intensity. The heat between them was overwhelming, consuming, as if they had both been waiting for this moment for far too long. Every touch, every movement sent sparks of electricity through her body, leaving her breathless and trembling with desire. Luca's hands roamed over her body, his touch both rough and tender, as if he couldn't get enough of her. His fingers traced the curve of her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. His lips moved from hers, trailing down her neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Sophia gasped, her head falling back as Luca's mouth explored her skin, his teeth grazing her collarbone in a way that made her entire body shudder with need. "I've wanted you since the moment I laid eyes on you," Luca growled against her skin, his voice filled with raw hunger. "But I've never wanted anyone the way I want you now." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clung to him, her body aching with the need to be closer, to feel him in every possible way. "Then take me," she whispered, her voice breathless, filled with a desire she could no longer deny. "I'm yours, Luca." The words seemed to break whatever remained of Luca's restraint. With a low growl, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her effortlessly across the room and laying her down on the bed. His eyes burned with desire as he looked down at her, his chest rising and falling with the force of his emotions. "You're mine," Luca whispered, his voice filled with a possessiveness that sent a thrill through her entire body. "And I'm never letting you go." Sophia's breath caught as Luca lowered himself onto the bed beside her, his lips capturing hers once more. This time, the kiss was slower, deeper, filled with an intimacy that took her breath away. His hands moved over her body with a reverence she hadn't expected, as if he were memorizing every curve, every inch of her, with his touch. Every brush of his fingers, every kiss, sent waves of heat coursing through her body, leaving her trembling with anticipation. The weight of him pressed against her, grounding her in the moment, reminding her that this was real, that this was happening. "I need you," Luca murmured against her lips, his voice rough with desire. "Tell me you need me too." Sophia's heart raced, her body arching against his as she whispered the words that had been on the tip of her tongue for so long. "I need you, Luca. More than anything." Luca's eyes darkened with desire at her words, and without another moment's hesitation, he gave in completely. The world outside faded into nothingness as their bodies moved together, a perfect harmony of passion and need. Every touch, every kiss was a promise that no matter what happened next, they were in this together, bound by something deeper than either of them could have imagined. The intensity of their connection, the raw emotion that pulsed between them, left Sophia breathless. She had never felt anything like this before, had never known it was possible to feel so completely consumed by another person. And as Luca's hands gripped her tightly, as his body moved against hers, she knew that this moment, this night, would change everything. The world around them melted away as they lost themselves in each other, their movements frantic and desperate, as if they were trying to make up for all the time they had spent fighting against this, against what they both knew had always been inevitable. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the aftermath of their passion, breathing heavily, Luca pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he was afraid to let go. His heart pounded against hers, a steady rhythm that grounded them both in the reality of the moment. "I can't let you go, Sophia," Luca whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't." Sophia's breath caught at the raw vulnerability in his words, at the way he held her so tightly, as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. And in that moment, she knew that, no matter what had happened before, no matter how dangerous their world was, she couldn't let him go either. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with certainty. Luca's arms tightened around her, and for the first time since they had met, Sophia felt truly safe. Not because Luca was a powerful man who could protect her from anything, but because, in this moment, she knew he would do anything to keep her safe. He had already proven that. And as they lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophia realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not just freedom, but love.